FALTER Radio, der Podcast mit Raimund Löw.
Sehr herzlich willkommen zum FALTER Radio für Samstag, den 29.09.2018, in dem es um Brexit geht, dem Austritt Großbritanniens aus der Europäischen Union. Die Verhandlungen über die Scheidung gehen in ihre letzte Phase. Wie Europa aussieht nach dem Austrittsdatum am 29. März 2019, das entscheidet sich in den nächsten Wochen. Diese Woche tagte in Liverpool der Parteitag der oppositionellen Labour Party. Nächste Woche sind die Konservativen dran. Die Modalitäten für Brexit stehen im Zentrum. Die Journalistin Tessa, die seit Jahren als Korrespondentin für verschiedene Zeitungen, auch für den FALTER, aus London berichtet, hat ein Buch geschrieben. Das hilft zu verstehen, wie Großbritannien tickt. Das Buch Echte Engländer, Britannien und der Brexit ist im Picus Verlag erschienen. Zur Präsentation im Kreisky-Forum in Wien hat Tessa Szyszkowitz einen der bekanntesten Journalisten Großbritanniens geladen. Gideon Rachman ist Buchautor, Sonderkorrespondent der Financial Times und er betreut auch den Podcast der Financial Times. Wir bringen für Sie Ausschnitte des in Englisch geführten Gesprächs über Brexit im Kreisky-Forum. Rachman war ursprünglich ein Gegner der Europäischen Union, sagte er im Gespräch mit Tessa Szyszkowitz. Aber er hat seine Meinung geändert und bei der Volksabstimmung vor 2 Jahren für Remain gestimmt.
You perhaps foolishly invited me to talk a little bit about where I was coming from and how that sort of fits into the British debate. And you mentioned that when we met, I was fairly strong Eurosceptic, but I ended up voting to remain, and I think that was a right thing to do, increasingly. But let me perhaps explain through my own arguments. I think it sort of internal arguments about Europe. Some of what I think strike you and many people outside Britain as very bizarre and sort of slightly strange direction of the British-European debate. So why was I a Eurosceptic when we first met? I mean, I think there's one thing to understand about the British debate, which is that there is, I think, particularly on the Eurosceptic side, a strong sense of British exceptionalism on politics, and in a positive way, so that, you know, as I think, did you mention, or was it just in your written thing, but as this kind of immigrant to the country, of Jewish background, you think, okay, well, Britain has a lot going for it. You know, it's a long history of political stability and tolerance. And so you think, okay, now there's this European project building to create a new political union in Europe. Well, why would we swap this British system, which seems to work quite well, for a new venture, a new European venture? And that was sort of where I started from. It's an inherently conservative position that Britain's politics work well, so frankly, I'm not sure I want to go in towards this European political union. Secondly, there was a slightly more, looking at it from the other angle, scepticism on my part, which I think, again, I would say has been justified to some extent about the durability of the European project. And maybe it was I think, a discussion we had a lot in Brussels about whether this was a particularly English perspective, but a sense that the national identities in Europe were so powerful, the linguistic differences were important, that it was going to be extremely hard to create a European political union around these different identities, and that at some point the project would run into the national identities, and by pushing it too far, you were going to create a crisis. And I think, you know, the jury is out, but I think there is some evidence for that. The backlash during the Euro crisis, the rise of nationalist parties, that part of the analysis was also, broadly speaking, had some basis. Thirdly, I mean, I should admit to a kind of innate British suspicion. I mean, you mentioned that as an Echte England, I don't speak German, and I think it does matter. The British debate about English, about the European Union is conducted in English. There's not much two-way. You know, most British people most British people won't speak some French, but that's the language we're kind of taught, so we might have some insight into that debate, but beyond that, maybe not. And I think that you mentioned the peace project here, which is very innate in Europe, and which I did learn about in Brussels, and did sort of temper my view of the European Union. But I think that when the Brits become aware that there is this political project going on, their rather crude assumption is, oh, this is like all about Germany wanting to take over Europe again. And you will have heard that a lot. And when that first came out with the Maastricht Treaty, one of the Thatcherite ministers who resigned, Nicholas Ridley, actually said that and in fact had to resign because of it. But I think that strain of suspicion that, hang on, this is not just a project we don't want to join in, but as actually there's an undercurrent of aggression towards Britain. It's something I no longer believe, but I certainly remember thinking it, and I think it's definitely there in Britain. So that explains I think the kind of intellectual background to what was going on, plus immigration, which I think you're quite right, played a very important part in the debate. There was a heavy immigration to Britain after the enlargement of the EU, and although it wasn't something that particularly motivated me, I think it was a big part of the argument. And just briefly, so why, given all that, did I vote Remain? Partly because I felt that actually Cameron said he wanted a special deal. Well, we had one. We had negotiated it after over 30 years or so. The British are not part of the euro. They had exemptions from Schengen, etc. So we had a pretty sweet deal. So it seemed a mistake to throw that away. I felt that although the political project, people talked airily about political union, actually the key political decisions in Britain are still national. Do we go to war or not? Parliament decides. What's the level of taxation? Parliament decides. So I didn't feel that the encroachments on sovereignty were so outrageous that you had to leave. Secondly, the economic damage, which was evident then, and it's become much more evident now. And I say with some embarrassment that even though I spent 5 years in Brussels, I actually had no idea how complicated it was to leave the European Union. And it's a sort of educational process trying to do it, because you don't realise how incredibly intricated the legal systems are, the intricacies of customs union, internal market. I knew Britain had a weak hand. I didn't realise quite how weak until we started trying to get out of this thing. And it's going to do a lot of damage to the economy, and I don't think that you can forget that. On a more positive note, though, I think that it's become more apparent to me that the European Union, particularly in this new climate of populism, nationalism and so on, represents an effort to preserve some kind of liberal values across Europe and indeed around the world that Britain should I think, be supporting. With the rise of China as either the largest or the second largest economy in the world and a highly authoritarian country, with the rise of Trump, I don't think those values can any longer be taken for question. We used to think after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that really that it was all going one way. Clearly it's not. And even within Europe, you have the debates around Orban, the Poles, etc., and nationalist parties doing well in France, the Netherlands, and indeed Austria. And so it was disturbing to me when we had the debate in the European Parliament last week, when the British Tories voted to support Orban. And I thought, well, that's kind of where this is leading us, because they have got themselves into a position where they're so hostile to European integration and so desperate for any friends that you're on the same side as Orban, and I don't think you should be there. So that's also, I think, a very important part of the debate, which is still not really understood in Britain, but obviously if you write about international affairs, you can't but avoid it. So that's where I'm starting from. But as I say, this is really about your book. So can I ask you a question, which is, as you said, you've been in Britain for 8 years, and you were very surprised by the Eurosceptic tone of the debate. When you came to write the book, what do you feel you particularly learnt over the course of the years about the British debate? And was there any validity to what the skeptics were saying?
Well, when we sort of, around the referendum, when we realized how strong and how dangerous actually the Euroscepticism had become. And I think what was not so clear to all of us was how important the Maastricht Treaty and the debate around the political union, how important it was in the perception of the general public, because the European Union issues are always extremely complicated, as you say, in every country. Nobody really understands how it works. Even the experts are challenged to explain it in a way so that anyone else understands something. But Maastricht in Britain, I think, opened an abyss, or sort of the door to no return. And you're right that Britain got all the opt-outs from everything always that was sort of, quite generous actually from the European Union leaders. But there is a promise in the Maastricht Treaty for a political union, and a promise that you should actually come to the currency. You get an opt-out, but, eventually the vision was to bring everyone together. And Nigel Farage, who at a meeting recently with foreign correspondents, Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, who was the big winner of the referendum night because he was so happy to understand that his Independence Day is now actually coming. And he told us how he, in his first years, tried to get the public to get interest in his subject of Brexit. And at the first meeting he ever held, he was actually standing alone, and nobody came. And that was sort of, at the beginning of the 90s, it was after Maastricht, and people were not there with him. But in 96, he founded UKIP, and then it sort of gained momentum. And certainly by the time the financial crisis hit the world and also Britain hard, the sort of all this seed had sort of grown into a really strong tree. But we still didn't understand it, I think, because when David Cameron put the referendum on the agenda, we were thinking that is dangerous, but he himself and the party did not think that that people would actually vote for it. So I think Maastricht is an important thing to understand.
Yeah, no, I think
which
so.
I learned then later.
Very much so. And I mean, that was just, I remember it very distinctly because it was just when I was more or less relatively fresh out of university, and the impact of that was huge. And a lot of the people who have now triumphed were turned by Maastricht and have been campaigning ever since. And I think it's to do with, as I say, this realization in the UK, born out of our own ignorance, that, oh my God, there really is this project to create a political union, because we thought we'd signed up for this European Economic Community. And then suddenly, this is actually, I think, partly why this slightly absurd debate about the passports, we want our passports back. But I remember, while I was living in Bangkok, going to get my new British passport from the embassy and saying, what's this? Like, it's changed colour and it now says European Union. What did they created a European Union? I was just living in Asia at the time. I wasn't really following it. And so it did seem a bit strange. And some people reacted very viscerally and said, no, we never signed up for this. And that was still the argument being made. Now, that was the argument at the intellectual level, but whether ordinary people voted on that, I'm less sure. I mean, I think it was, to some extent, a classic protest vote, a sense that, this is an establishment project and we don't like the establishment and we're going to vote against it. And the division between London and the rest of the country became very evident. And I think that the coalition of voters who came together for Brexit was similar to the coalition of voters that came together for Trump. So that one of the clearest distinctions as to whether you'd vote for Trump or whether you'd vote for Brexit was had you been to university or not. Graduates were like 70% against Brexit, but non-graduates were in favour. And similarly, big cities, I think only one big city voted for Brexit, Sheffield. For the rest, cities voted to stay in, but outside the big cities, they voted to leave. And how much chance did you get to report outside in those areas, and what did you discover?
Well, I was traveling as much as I could, even if that's not always supported by my editorial offices, because you have to pay expenses if you travel, so they actually like us to sit at the desk and write from there. But I did travel quite a lot, and my colleagues did too, and I think among the foreign correspondents were a pretty high percentage of people who knew how dangerous this would be, because we actually left the Westminster bubble, which we don't totally belong to us as foreign correspondents. And I met so many people in Cornwall or in Birmingham, and you would know that there was anger out there, and that we had felt already in the Scotland independence referendum how little Westminster understood of the emotional state the Scots in 2014-15 were in, but how the countryside in England viewed the slightly aloof government in Westminster and their understanding of sort of pushing liberalization and glorifying London as the global capital of finance with Arab princes, Russian oligarchs, high house prices, and so many people in England cannot go to the theatre to London because they just simply can't afford to go and buy an expensive ticket, go and have dinner, which is also extremely expensive. Whoever comes to London always ends up eating spaghetti in my kitchen.
It's getting cheaper because the pound's falling.
Yeah, so. It's true. It's getting cheaper, but it's also not getting cheaper. It's only for the visitors cheaper.
Exactly.
It's not for the people from the countryside. So I think you're totally right that this vote against Brexit was certainly an age of anger protest vote against everything that didn't go well.
And did you personally feel hostility as somebody, from Europe, etc.? Because one of the things I've felt a bit defensive about and nervous about is a bit that the Brexit vote is portrayed as xenophobia, essentially. And I don't know. I mean, instinctively, I want to say, no, it's not that. It's not really that. But maybe it is. What did you feel? Well,
I have a lot of friends and also colleagues. My Polish colleague, they were very frustrated. Also, a French colleague of mine, they got really shouted at when they spoke in their native languages with their children on the bus or in school or something. I have never had this. I don't know why. I mean, it's maybe by accident. But when I went once with Gerald to a pub in outside of London, and we were sitting there, and it's a scene that I describe in the book because I wanted to speak to the people in the pub outside of London. It's a relatively wealthy area. It's not a desperate economic situation there, and I wanted to know 2 years after they voted for or against Brexit what they think. And we were sitting there, and they were so surprised that we even came. They never really see people like us because it's not a tourist area.
Where was it?
Outside
Milton
Keynes, in a village, beautiful little village with little Tudor houses and apple trees and afternoon sun and pint of beer, and it was really bucolic, wonderful. And they were very, very nice, and they were all hard Brexiteers to an extent where you thought you were in the parody of what is happening, because they were chirpy and were saying, let's get on with Brexit and don't misunderstand us as being racist, but we just don't want to be with you in a club where you decide about us, and you have to understand that we were ruling the world, and we don't need this nitty-gritty process. And I think that's one of the real keys to understand England, because this was really a vote of England against the European Union, because the Scots and Northern Ireland voted for Remain, and Wales sort of doesn't really count because they're friendly but dependent. I'm really sorry. And actually, there also, of course, there the mood was shifting a little bit lately in Wales. But anyway, so the English vote, I think, has to be also understood as a nation that not only started early with democratic control on their kings. It started early in nation building with other sort of in union building, quite violently, but sort of sooner or later the Scots and Northern Ireland in that case, and Wales came together with the English in a union. So they have always looked, and not to forget the economic development with industrialization and ruling an empire, which was partly bigger than anything else for a certain period of time. So the English nation looked at Europe always a little bit with...
Yeah, do we need this?
I mean, what for? Yeah, this is all children's work. And my theory is that, somehow England lost the edge over Europe, and by the end of the 90s and the 2000s, there was a stagnation effect that came into the economy. The productivity is low. Brexit only amplifies now all the problems that you have in Great Britain, and that's really the subject of the book also. What will happen after Brexit? Because, of course, we all didn't know how chaotic this would be and how difficult it would be. Theresa May certainly totally underestimated the implications on how to leave a single market, not only because of Northern Ireland, but in general. And so, for me, the big question is, and I want to ask you this too, if you see the chances that could come out of it, because for me, if you reform, if you take the energy of this new beginning and you turn it into something good, what could it be?
Well, I'd like to believe it could be all right, but I'm not hugely optimistic. I mean, partly because of changes in the world, actually, because you mentioned that this is a project that starts in the early 90s with Maastricht. And that is a very different world. The Berlin Wall has just come down. The world is opening up. It's a world of globalization and a free trade. And I think that the Brexiteers are stuck with a 1990s vision, which is not just to do with Maastricht in the European Union, but with that world still existing. But actually, the world is becoming more protectionist with Donald Trump and with the developments in Asia. So we're at risk of leaving, as the world is splitting up into trade blocs, of leaving our bloc. And suddenly finding, you know what, there aren't these great free trade deals to do out there. Maybe there would have been 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, but it's going to be quite hard, I think. So that's rather difficult. I mean, clearly there can be some advantages because if you're not bound by the 27 rule book, you can look for, well, things that we can do to make ourselves more attractive. We can certainly redo our immigration laws, and I think that one of the things that drove it, aside from just a sense that, there are too many foreigners coming in, and I think basically it was that as crude as that. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of Asian immigrants voted to leave the EU, and certainly my wife works in a National Health Service hospital, and she was the only person who voted to stay. All her colleagues are from India and the Philippines. They all voted to leave. And she was saying, well, why? And partly it's kind of the patriotism of people who've just arrived. And for them it was a sort of affirmatory vote about Britain's great, and, we feel part of it. Partly it was that they feel no emotional connection to Europe. We go and have always gone on holiday to France or Italy, whatever. They don't. They go to Asia or whatever. And partly it was the immigration laws that they felt, look, why should we let all these Europeans in who can just come in and settle, and our relatives find it very hard to come in? So maybe we can change the immigration laws so that they're more open to the world and less open to Europe. And that, I think, is a bit of an illusion, because I think the Nigel Farage people, the last thing they want to do is have more immigrants from India. It's not like that wasn't the idea. But I do think that you might be able to have a better immigration regime which focused on highly skilled people from all over the world, whether it's the US, Australia, India, wherever. So that could be one thing, but I think overall it's and I also sort of think that over the course of maybe 10, 15 years, if we're lucky, we'll adjust. People do, countries do. But I think that the 10 years could be quite rough. And I also, I think one of the other things that's occurred to me is that, the British had a real low ebb in the 70s. The IMF, we even had to have the IMF in, and that was one of the reasons that we joined the European Union. Actually, the IMF came in 76 and we joined in 73, but there was this sense of economic decline that we had to get on with it. I think a lot of British people felt that there was an economic revival associated with Thatcherism, but I wonder whether it was also associated with joining the EU and the size of the market, the European market, the integration, the sense that it did give some positive effect to productivity, which we may have discounted because we told ourselves a different story, that it was all about Thatcher's reforms. But actually they were kind of around the same time. Very difficult to disentangle, but we may find once we leave the EU that actually it was much more part of the economic success of London, certainly, than we thought.
But one of the points that is always mentioned now by the Brexiters, and Liam Fox, the Secretary for International Trade, is that what his officials call, half ironically, Empire 2.0 will be established now, and the Indians will be so happy because now Britain will again trade in very close terms and freed of the chains of the European Union rules and all these kind of things. And I was looking into that because I think that's a valid thought, actually, that the wider world now is more open to Britain than it is now under the EU rules. And coming from Austria and our history of the empire with the Habsburg Empire, I was thinking we had now 100 years since the Austrian Empire ended and we turned into a republic. And then I thought Britain went very fast from being not an empire anymore to a sort of small crisis in identity and thinking what is happening, because at the time the European Union was sort of just in the 50s just sort of gaining force and speed. And then for a while it didn't work, but then you joined without ever really, in my view, deeply discussing the implications of having been an empire and what that meant for the British society, but also for the various nations that had been colonies, sure, from the Africans and the Southeast Asia and all over the place. And when I looked closely into this, for example, I discovered that Britain doesn't have a museum for the history of the empire that is extensive. I mean, you have an Imperial War Museum, which is a classic, so you can look at all the planes and the tanks that it's a very good museum, I have to say. They also have very critical, good exhibitions. But there's no sort of debate on the implications of the society of having been an oppressor for a long time and having lived on the profits of the colonies. And the second thing is the history of slave trade, which is practically not existing in the British public, in the collective consciousness, partly because the slaves were kept outside. It's not like in the States where, nobody can pretend not to have known that there were slaves kept in the South mostly. But in Britain, and it was actually a conversation with you that made that so clear to me when we were sitting having coffee in the Shard, looking down on the Thames and on the tower and the bridge and all the skyscrapers, which are now sort of the temples of power, where the banks and the insurance companies are sort of shaping the fate of Britain, but also good parts of the European economy. And you were saying that whenever there was a problem with the wonderful trading nation of Britain, it was sending its ships to enforce the contracts. And that's something I think which Britain could really spend some time on looking into and debating, don't you think?
No, I think definitely. I mean, I think that, one of the things that you often hear from Europeans, which is a slight misunderstanding, I think, from my experience, is that Britain is obsessed with its imperial past, etc., and that's why they're it's sort of half true, but actually it's untrue in the sense that, as you said, there is no museum of empire. And when I was growing up as a kid in Britain, the obsession was with the Second World War, not with the empire. You know, all the movies we watched were a Battle of Britain, Great Escape, etc., because that was a much more comforting narrative, because that's Britain as fighting for democracy and alone, and it's all quite glorious. The empire is much more, you know, do we really want to stress that? So it was not really something we discussed, but I think it was there at the back of people's minds in some way, certainly some of the Brexiters. So when they say, you know, we used to be this great country and now we're like one of 27 and Luxembourg can veto what we're doing, you know, screw that. And I think there's something in there, that this sense of grandeur, lost grandeur, which is not articulated but is connected to empire. But I also think it's a very dangerous combination, because it leads to, on the one hand, the sense that there is this much greater destiny that we could have, but the ignorance about what the empire really was and where it came from, and the lack of imperial history. I mean, I did a history degree in Britain, including a lot of British history, with very little history of the empire. Even that, you know, it was all parliamentary history and Europe, but not much discussion of how the empire arose. But that's dangerous because it means that they confuse being a trading nation with being an imperial nation. And what do I mean by that? So that you would have at the Tory party conference, people will stand up and say, we were this great trading nation, you know, we trade with India, China, etc. But they didn't really know the history of that. So how did the East India Company, which essentially colonized India, I mean, the transition from it being a trading company to being the British Empire is when their trading contracts essentially ripped up. And they say, well, we're not accepting that. And they actually send an army, and then they conquer the Bengalis. And the East India Company actually runs India for about 100 years. And then there's a mutiny, and the British government takes over directly in the mid-19th century. But equally, our confrontation with China is kind of forgotten. So that if you look in Tony Blair's autobiography, he records, one of the first things he does is go to China in 1997 to hand back Hong Kong after the 100-year lease that we had forced out of the Chinese at the point of a gunboat ends. And he says, the Chinese president says to him, well, I hope we can put history behind us. And Blair actually writes, I wasn't even sure what he meant because I didn't really know the history. And he said, I now do, and I sort of understand what he meant, you know. But it's an incredible confession of ignorance. But it's dangerous, again, because it's this sense that, oh, well, you know, we can just go back to being a big trading nation. Well, we were an imperial nation. And so we can't send gunboats anymore to get our trade deal. That's not going to happen. And equally, the countries that we want to do these trade deals with, they do remember the history. So that I remember being in India and talking actually to a mutual friend from Brussels who's now the Portuguese ambassador. And I said, what do you think of the British chances of getting a trade deal? And he said, well, of course it's going to be very hard because you're Britain. And I said, oh, but like I thought we had all these connections. And he said, well, you do, but it's not necessarily so positive. It's kind of a mixed, at best, a very ambivalent relationship with India. And the same with China.
Will be easier maybe with Australia and New Zealand, who signalled more kindness, but trade with them is also... Yeah,
but Australia is a great place, but there's 25 million Australians. It's not going to turn the world on its head, you know, and they're the other side of the world. And anyway, we kind of abandoned them. That was the whole point of joining the European Union, and the debate in the 70s was about, can we, in good conscience, stop giving preference to New Zealand butter? Believe it or not, that was a really important thing, because these guys had fought with us, kith and kin, etc., etc. And as part of joining the European Union, we had to give preference to European agricultural products. And that was a difficult thing. And as a result, Australia and New Zealand went through quite tough times and had to reorient their economies, and they're now basically deeply integrated into a China-centric Asian economy.
Which brings me to the subject of China, because your so far latest book was called Easternization, and it deals with the rise of China. And it's really, as you said before, kind of funny that at the moment where these trade blocs form and there's such big nations rising, becoming more and more powerful, that Britain turns its back to the European Union, which is its trading bloc. But that's a deeply pro-European way of looking at it. I wonder if flexible modern liberal economy maybe can sort of sail between these blocks and make its success story?
We're going to find out, maybe. I mean, I had quite a funny conversation with a Malaysian friend who'd been at university with me in England and now, it's half in Malaysia and sometimes in Britain. And I said, exactly that. Do you think it's possible? And he said, oh, sure, it's possible. But you'll just have to lower your standards a bit. Stop looking into where people's money's come from. Don't ask questions like that. Stop all this anti-corruption stuff. And I thought, oh, great. That's not necessarily the country we want to be. But and we're having that argument actually vis-a-vis Russian money in Britain at precisely this moment.
That, and this was something that Misha Glenny, the author of Mafia, said when it was a debate about this in the spring, how to control now the influx of corrupt Russian money in order to hit also Putin's cronies. And he said it's not about only the Russian money. If you sort of crack down on Russian money, then if the Arab princes and the all sorts of Colombian drug lords realize that the Russian money is not safe,
sure,
they will move their money somewhere else. So if we're talking big money and big loss potentially if Britain comes clean on sort of the laundromat of corruption.
Yeah, and also I think although there is some chance to be regulatorily even looser and to attract even more of that stuff, do we want to do it? But actually Britain's been very successful at it within the European Union. It's like a false choice to think that you can either be global or European. In fact, Britain's model was to be the world's entry point to Europe. And so I think Britain, could become possibly a bit more attractive as a sort of pirate economy with no regulations, but it loses the access to Europe, which was part of the point.
Yeah, definitely. And the other side of the globe then with the special relationship with the United States, it's also kind of irritating. I mean, you're the America expert and you spend quite a lot of time also in Washington and discussing the future of this special relationship, which, as far as I know, has always only been called special relationship on the British side and not on the American side.
Well, there's an extraordinary number of countries that think they have a special relationship with America, including Japan, Germany to some extent, Israel. I mean, we've all got... there is a sort of special relationship on intelligence and things like that, but nuclear weapons. But I don't think it will do us much good trade-wise with Trump because Trump, A, is a protectionist, and B, look at how he treats his allies. Look what he's doing to Canada, another country that has a special relationship with the United States. He's completely merciless and completely without any sense of, well, we're going to do you a favor because you're our old friends. None of that. So I think that the election of Trump was interesting because initially your friend Farage and people like that were triumphant about it, and Farage still is, because they said, okay, this guy hates the European Union and he's going to help us. And actually that's another reason why I became more pro-EU, precisely because you could see those international links, that Trump is very closely connected to some quite sinister forces in Europe, and did we want to be part of that? Not really. But I don't think the fact that Trump, in some broad sense, or Bannon, the people around him, think of the Eurosceptics as ideological kind of soulmates means that they will give Britain a good trade deal. Not at all.
No. But I was sitting with farmers in Northern Ireland. They were all really hoping that there will be the softest Brexit possible because they of course have to fear an American trade agreement with Britain most because their production will be too expensive for American meat being flooded on the British market.
Well, I think if the Americans make allowing American agricultural products into Britain the point, and I think that for them that is the point because it's a huge sector for them, it may just be impossible to do a trade deal with Britain because people have got this idea of hormone-fed American beef, which actually, incidentally, we all go and eat quite happily in America, but we're certainly not having it in Britain.
No.
And so,
or in Vienna.
So this idea that American agriculture is kind of inherently disgusting, is quite deeply rooted in Britain, and I think it's going to be really hard to persuade the British, unless we're really flat on our backs, to do a deal on that basis. But one of the things one discovers, actually, is when we leave the EU, you instantly hit the EU tariff wall on agriculture. So food will become more expensive, certainly, and exports will be harder.
For sure. And also the political relationship with Washington, it's quite interesting because, for a while the American society political system was more modern than the British one. It's a republic versus a monarchy and much more equal society, not so many classes like you have in Britain, and you didn't originally have people who owned so much money, so much land like you have in Britain, the Duke of Westminster and all those people who inherited this over centuries, and nobody ever said, okay, a little reform might be in place and we'll take this away from you. And so America was seen as the modern and suddenly more successful also cousin or something. And within 2 years, it has turned into a madhouse where you don't know what values the Trump administration actually follows or has or will develop the next night at 4 o'clock in the morning when he's back on Twitter. So suddenly, do you think someone in Britain understands that the values of the European Union are actually more closer to the British political establishment?
Yeah,
now?
I mean, I think in a funny way, some of the people around Theresa May know that, because they're the ones who are having to make decisions on foreign policy, know that when it's come to Iran, Britain voted with the EU, not with the US, on this recent deal. On the Paris Climate Accord, Britain voted with the EU, not with the US. And so on a series of these things that Trump has done, even though we're leaving the European Union, we're still voting with the European Union. And it was really interesting talking to some of the people around May about after the whole Novichok poisoning in Britain, and the British suddenly needed to try to get some international reaction against Russia. One of the guys closely involved with it said that the first phone call between May and Trump was disastrous. Trump said, we're not going to do anything. And then he said, why should we help you unless the Europeans, they're your neighbours, get help from them. And so the British then had to go to France and Germany, etc., in the middle of all this Brexit stuff and say, look, can we have a bit of solidarity on this? And they got it. And it was only when that happened that they could go back to Washington at the end of the week and say, okay, Europe's lined up, at which point Trump sort of reluctantly fell into line. And so the lesson that they drew was actually in a crisis, and he said it's a complete reversal of how it used to be. He said we used to be able to go to Washington and say, it's us, it's Britain, here's what we need. And you'd instantly, they may not totally agree, but there'd be a bond and a sense, okay, we'll do our best to help you here. And he said, that's gone. So it's quite shocking. But, that's people who are involved in the day-to-day business of international diplomacy. They're the first to notice it. Whether it'll take something else for it to percolate down into British society.
Today, Austrian news was full of that there will be new elections, and Theresa May is preparing for them. And I really don't think that this is in her interest. It certainly is in the interest of the Labour Party, and it could actually lead Jeremy Corbyn to Downing Street 10. But those who are in power would be quite foolish to now call elections. And you can argue that she would want to have her plan be backed up by the public, but that's a really questionable thing to do because the public doesn't necessarily back her plan. So the new elections will be called when her Parliament deal when the deal that she might get with the European Union fails in Parliament in November or December or January, whenever they come to a conclusion. And what I feel is going on now on the side of Theresa May and her whole Churchillian talk about we will stand by our plan and Europe must understand that Britain will not budge and we are strong. All this is really to prepare the stage for the final negotiations with the European Union, and also to rally her own country behind her. Because if people think the European Union is mean to her, her chances to actually get a deal through with her own people is slightly better than if she has a divided country behind her where people want to kill her because the European Union is nice to her. I mean, all these things play into this momentarily very, very sort of hot atmosphere where everyone is trying to find a new escalation point. Yeah? The second thing is the Labour Party in the second referendum.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the, this is possibly too much detail about British politics. I wouldn't want to inflict on you, but one of the depressing things, if you would prefer Britain to stay in the European Union, which I would, is that the Labour Party, which should be making this case, isn't. So the second referendum, as you mentioned, which they promised, doesn't allow a vote for Remain. It's just, do you accept the deal May as negotiated or reject it? And the reason for that is the Labour Party has been taken over by the hard left, who also want us to leave the European Union so they can create a true socialist society in Britain, mad as that may sound. And so, it's basically the equivalent of Jean-Luc Mélenchon or whatever. It's that kind of leftist Euroscepticism that currently runs the British Labour Party. So the people, and there's substantial numbers of them, who want Britain to remain, do not have a political party to represent them other than the Liberal Democrats, who are at 8% in the polls.
If we are, more or less all of us here, I think, of the opinion that Britain should stay in the European Union, how best to achieve this? Shall we wish for Theresa May to succeed? Shall we wish her to fail? Do we want chaos in Britain? Will chaos bring anything positive? Because, sometimes I think, I hope she gets this through and not Boris Johnson comes in. But then again, if he comes in, he will certainly make such a mess that within a few months everything will break apart. And maybe then comes a moderate politician who says, let's hold off and let's rethink the whole situation. What do you think? Yeah,
well, I've had exactly the same confusion and the same kind of a mixture between emotions pulling me one way and intellect pulling me other. So when May won an important parliamentary vote that moved us closer to Brexit, my instinctive reaction was, oh no, because I don't want this thing to happen. But then when I thought about it, I thought, okay, what happens if she loses? I suspect that we would still leave, but in conditions of greater chaos with worse people running it. My die-hard Remainer friends want the whole thing to collapse. They believe in almost a kind of catastrophist theory that we either have to have no deal or a collapse in government, and only then will we create the conditions to have a second referendum, and only then will people see what an incredibly stupid idea this is, and then they will reject it. And if all those things happened, I'd be delighted. But for me, it's too big a risk, because I think that, let's say you have a no-deal Brexit, breakdown in the economy, national humiliation, which is how it will be seen. Generally, people under those kinds of circumstances don't say, oh, I'm going to vote for the moderate party. Generally, they get driven to the extremes. They'll go to the far right, they'll go to the far left. So, very reluctantly, maybe because I'm a sort of, cautious person, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to go through with this and then rebuild relations with Europe over the course of 10 or 20 years and end up with something which will look rather like membership of the European Union. In fact, I remember talking to one of Boris Johnson's speechwriters, and we were talking about how nobody believes in this. So this is... Well, Boris is gone, so the guy won't lose his job. So he said to me, I said, you don't believe in this, do you? And he said, oh, no, absolutely not. And I said, did you tell Boris? And he said, yeah, I said at the job interview, I don't believe in this. And Boris said, oh, forget it, I don't worry, I don't mind, it's fine, nobody does, He didn't quite put it like that, but Boris didn't say that's a disqualifying thing. He said, I still want you as my speechwriter. And then this guy said to me, look, he said, it's also futile in the sense that basically what we're going to do is we're going to leave and then we're going to spend the entire time trying to recreate what we had, but we'll just end up with something a little bit worse.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that is the summit of our ambition.
Das war ein Gespräch, das Tessa Szyszkowitz mit dem Kolumnisten der Financial Times, Gideon Rachman, im Kreisky-Forum in Wien geführt hat. Anlass war die Präsentation des Buches Echte Engländer, das im Picus Verlag erschienen ist. Ich bedanke mich beim Kreisky-Forum, das uns die Aufnahme zur Verfügung gestellt hat. Ich verabschiede mich bei den Zuhörern im Freirad Tirol und auf Radio Agora. Der Falter bietet Hintergrundinformationen nicht nur über Wien und über Österreich, sondern auch über Europa. Abonnieren kann man den Falter auch im Internet. Das geht über die Homepage www.falter.at/abo. Ein Probeabo ist 4 Wochen gratis. Die Signation kommt von Ursula Winterauer, die Technik betreut Anna Goldenberg. Danke fürs Zuhören und bis zur nächsten Folge.
Sie hörten das Falterradio, den Podcast mit Raimund Löw.